Thanks for listening to the Granite List.Live. Today's episode is brought to you by Connect Healthcare Collaboration, where benefits marketing meets clinical advocacy to drive effective employee engagement. This is the Granite List.Live, where we explore all things human capital and employee benefits related. I'm your host, Sally Pace, and today we're going to be discussing the dreaded emergency room. I have on the show Al Lewis, who is the Quizmeister-in-Chief at Quizzify. And Al, before we rush straight to the emergency room, let's start by talking about the genesis of and the background of Quizify.
Well, it started because I myself was doing a radio show in Washington, D.C., of all places, the NPR affiliate down there. Don't ask how I ended up hosting that show. But in any case, the first time I hosted, the producer said, okay, this was good for a first time. You'll sound better when you get over your cold. Well, newsflash, this is how I always sound, right? So I thought they were going to fire me, right away, right, when they figured that out. So I called back to my primary to get an appointment with an ENT because someone had told me years earlier I had a deviated septum, which I do. But so she gets me an appointment literally the next week, which this goes to show you how long ago this was. And so the ENT sticks a scope in my nose and says, well, you do have a deviated septum, but that's the least of your problems. You have polyps. Right. So she says, well, we could do one of four things. She said, we could operate and take them out. They could grow back. We could put you on an antibiotic for 3 weeks, or we could put you on antibiotic and Flonase, and I'm going to want a CAT scan of your sinuses. So the first thing I say, I have a decent amount of health literacy at this point myself. So I say, shouldn't we do the most conservative thing first? And she says, quote unquote, exact intonation, well, you could, like only an idiot would, right? So then I say, isn't 3 weeks, I said, I don't think it's bacterial, and isn't 3 weeks a long time for an antibiotic? She says, well, my patients get good results with the antibiotic. So I'm thinking, which of course is exactly the wrong answer, right? I mean, when I was doing disease management, we would put that in the category of exactly the wrong answer, right? So I decided I'm going to get out of there as quick as possible. Mind you, this whole visit's only 6 or 7 minutes. So I agree to get the Flonase for my hoarseness. And so I go home and I live, I don't know, maybe 10 minutes from the doctor. But by the time I came, there's already a voicemail scheduling this CT scan for my sinuses, right? So I ignore it because I didn't want to. I got the Flonase, and I was just going to do the Flonase. Well, they called back, and I thought, if I don't call back and cancel this thing, they're going to bill me for it, right? So I had to actually affirmatively call back and cancel it. And meanwhile, I'm still doing the Flonase, and then for my horses, and then I read the FDA package insert for the Flonase, and it says side effects can include hoarseness. So then I called back to the producer and I confess, and she said, oh, don't worry about it. We'll just give you some tea with some honey and just sip it when you're not talking. You'll be fine. So I'm thinking, if something that can be cured with tea and honey, I was going to get a CAT scan and operation and antibiotics for, there's something wrong with this system. There's something wrong with this system. And that's when I decided to start Quizify. And I had a background in trivia. So I actually I was on Jeopardy once, and I wrote a best-selling trivia game years ago. So I thought I can teach people healthcare using this trivia model to sort of Q&A, have a little fun with the quizzes. And by the way, on the radio show, it was called The Big Fix. You can still find episodes online. It ultimately did get taken off the air, but it wasn't because people called in and said, this host sounds like he has polyps. No, they just couldn't find an underwriter for it. So that's how Quizify started.
And today it's used by employers across the country, helping educate their employees on how to avoid CAT scans when they could be drinking tea and honey and unnecessary costs. And so, Al, as you and I have discussed many times recently, one of the most egregious expenses for employers that shows up time and again is emergency room visits. And you've spent a lot of time in this area, not in the emergency room, but helping create educational materials around it. So talk to me a little bit about what you're seeing and what you're doing.
Okay, so first, it's 6% of employees' health spend. It should be 3%, and we will get you to 3%. The things you should know about are, number one, the number of visits is going up, even though there are all these urgent care centers and minute clinics and telehealth and whatnot. And I think the reason is that it's just very difficult to get a regular appointment. So the number of visits is going up. The codes for the visits are going up. So you go from a 99281, which is basically someone showing up for a physical or something, to a 99285, which has a definition. You need consults and specialists and scans and all sorts of stuff. And it used to be about 5% were 99285s, and now it's about 15% are 99285s, and the 99281s are essentially gone. So the ERs are figuring out that they can upcode this stuff and get away with it. Now you might say, well, aren't the patients getting sicker? If the patients were getting sicker, the admit rate from the ER would be going up as well. The admit rate has been very constant since I've been measuring it. I go back to, 2000 or something. So they're basically ripping people off on the upcoding, and they're also ripping people off on the price. And the way they're doing that is, unlike electives where you can do direct contracting, you can steer gently or, through centers of excellence, however you want. You can't steer for ER. So they pretty much have you coming and going. And then when they do negotiate with your carrier, they will say, well, we have to charge a lot for ER because according to the Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act, EMTALA, we have to treat everybody, regardless of their insurance, if they have any or whatnot. We can't turn people away. So the carriers tend to give them a very good deal on insurance. As a result, a typical visit, well, it depends on what state you're in. Maryland is a world of its own, $800 or something. But Florida, New Jersey, Texas, California, Arizona, Colorado, these are in network. You're looking at, $3,000 or something. And the actual charge is going to be double that. So these are very expensive visits. Now, what happens when you go in is they put this screen in front of you and you're supposed to sign twice, once to consent to the treatment, once to consent to the payment. We ask people to print out the screen and sign the consent to treatment if you want to get treated, or the person who brought you in will sign or whatever. But for the financial consent, if you sign that consent, you're consenting to basically whatever they want to pay you, constrained only by the carrier, who really considers the hospital to be their customer. So they're not, negotiating real hard on this stuff. So you can either write in, it's now just 18 words, basically, I consent to pay 2 times Medicare for a correctly coded ER visit, including insurance. Or we have these little stickers you can put on and then sign the sticker. Or you have what's known as an auto consent, and we'll get to that later. But you get this consent, you give it back to them, unless they affirmatively object, which has only happened once. I'll even tell you where it was. It's come to Honor Hospital in Scottsdale, Arizona. It's only happened once. They take it back and they treat you. Well, performance is acceptance of your counter offer. Now, 2 times Medicare is usually quite inexpensive because Medicare, or whatever else you want to say about them, they're very good at limiting the cost of ER visits. So you're treated, you leave, you are entitled to your 2 times Medicare. The chances are about 80% you'll get the correct bill. 20% of the time, the bill comes in and it's wrong. And depending on the arrangement we have, I generally say, okay, for 25% of the savings, I'll take care of this for you. And typically it's one letter. Hospitals hate to be contacted on email. So naturally, I contact them on email. If you go to any hospital website, with the exception of the Surgery Center of Oklahoma, you will not find an email listed at all. We use Zoom Info, where they have all the hospital executives listed. So I write to about 6 or 7 of them, and I say, this is the consent. Here it is. I ask, one of the things it says on your little wallet card that you have here is to make a copy of it. You don't necessarily have to make a copy of it, but so I say, here's what it says. You accepted it, ... And most of the time they'll write back and that's the end of it. They'll accept it. And what we typically say is we don't say it's 2 times Medicare, because frankly, I have no idea what 2 times Medicare is. I mean, I know generally what it is, but I say, we'll send you a check. If we don't hear from you in 2 weeks, we'll send you a check for $850. Our best estimate is 2 times Medicare. If you want to give us a different estimate, that's fine too, but we'll send you a check for payment in full. And that's the end of it most of the time. Now, sometimes what will happen is the hospital will go back and forth a couple of times, and then they'll write the whole thing off. Or if we haven't made them an offer, they'll say, why don't we just call it $500? It's service quality breakdown. And I just think, wow, I'm a great negotiator. The reason they do that is if they agree to 2 times Medicare, that creates a precedent. Anytime somebody else wants to write 2 times Medicare, they can't disagree. They've already agreed with it. Now, the fact is whether they agree with it or not, that's contract law. This to me was frankly very profitable because I would charge 25% of savings, Validation Institute or me, depending on the arrangement, or Quizify. And it would take one letter and I'd save, I don't know, $2,500. Well, let's call it $2,400. So it's a round number. So I get $600 for 15 minutes of work. So I'm thinking this is really cool. Well, then there is a black swan event that basically eliminated all of my profit. So it's Ohio Health, and somebody used the consent, and Ohio Health sent them a bill for $5,600 and change for what should have been $800 and change. So they contacted me, and I said, fine, 25% of savings. They said, fine. So we write to them, and we say, we'll send you a check for $850 on October 15th. If we don't hear from you otherwise, with the estimate of 2 times Medicare, we'll send you a check for $850 for payment in full on October 15th. I have this whole thing down to a science here. So don't hear from them. October 15th comes. I tell the person exactly what I always say, write payment in full as agreed upon on the back of the check. When I went to law school, you put it on the front of the check. You don't have to put it on the back of the check. So they say, fine. Cash the check. They get the cancel check. And I say, great, that's the end of it. And they're going to write me the check for my savings. No, the hospital continued to bill them for the full amount. And so then I said, and this was a mistake on my part, actually, because this had never happened before. I said, well, why don't we sue them in small claims court so they to ice this $850? So we sued them, and I thought that would be the end of it. I said, they're not going to fight this. That'll be no. They fought it, So they got someone from a big law firm, not the brightest light in the firmament, but from a big law firm. And I looked this guy up, and he went to something called Capital Law School, which is the 161st ranked law school out of 174, the 13th worst law school in the country. So we go to sue them, and they do motions and counter motions, all sorts of try to get it thrown out of court or sent to municipal court because, and this was the mistake I made, typically in small claims court, if you've been to small claims court or watched Judge Judy, it's always some monetary amount. This was what they call equitable relief we were asking for, which is not monetary. We said we want them to stop harassing us. So their attorney said, well, this is not within the purview of small claims court, So we want it dismissed. So I wrote to the guy. I said, this is a contract. I said, maybe they didn't teach you this at the 13th worst law school in the country, but performance of a contract, of an offer is contract. And I said, this is my favorite part. I said, you may have heard of my law school if you have seen the movie Legally Blonde. Okay, so in any event, so naturally I don't hear from the guy. I've got some more disses lined up for him.
Oh, I'm certain you do.
Oh, I got to tell you what they're. So the first one is going to be, I'm going to write to the hospital and I'm going to say, next time you go up against one of my people, you might want to hire somebody from the top 20 law schools, or maybe at least the top 160. And I'm going to say, but don't worry, this guy's fine. I can understand why you'd want to get rid of him, but he'll do fine because he can just join all of his classmates and what they typically do. And I said, those ambulances, I'm going to say this, those ambulances aren't going to chase themselves. So, my son, who's a very well-known litigator, says, you really don't want to be dissing the other attorneys after. So I said, no, I'm never going to see this guy again. I want to diss him. I'm having a lot more fun on these podcasts dissing him than the 1 in a million odds that he ever, surfaces again. So this small claims case is like a Guinness Book of World Records because Ohio Health, I mean, with all the motions and counter motions and all this stuff, is spent about $50,000 on this in our estimation. And trial itself, have you ever been to small claims court, Sally?
Thankfully, I have not.
It's actually a very interesting experience. In fact, it's almost worth going just to watch.
Oh.
It's like Judge Judy. It's like Judge Judy.
I'll free up my calendar next Thursday.
Yeah. I mean, somebody comes in and says, they didn't pay me. I painted their house. And then the other person will say, oh, yeah, well, here are all the things you missed, and then the judge will, the whole thing takes 10 minutes, 15 minutes, And this case took 3.5 hours. 3.5 hours. And at one point, the judge is just so, he's seen these people before in Ohio Health because they've sued like 3,000 people, in the last 10 years, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so they had all these arguments, and their attorney is saying, they came to the ER, so they consented to our treatment. And the judge says, you people are in here all the time waving these consent forms, saying, look, they signed, they consented. And here is somebody who clearly did not consent, and you're saying they consented. And he says, I don't think you understand the basic contract. He says, it's been years since I studied basic contract law, but the guy says, well, I disagree with you on the law. This is not what somebody who went to the top 160 law schools would say. So it gets even better. Because they brought 2 witnesses, including an expert witness. Who the hell brings an expert witness to small claims court? This guy is an ER doctor, and he says, when the patient's on the floor, we have no idea how they pay. We just have to treat everybody the same way. We have no idea. That's a different department. Now, if I had been there, this was in Ohio, and they didn't allow video witnesses. If I'd been there, I would have said, yes, precisely. This is a different department. This is the business department that was supposed to say, we reject your consent. They accepted the consent. So you're essentially saying it was your own fault. It was your own organization's fault. So that was thing 1. Now, thing 2 was this check that they cashed, right? And they had a witness there who ran their billing department, and they, was asked about that. And they said, well, that wasn't us. That was our bank, and that's agency law 101, right? And once again, the plaintiff, her husband was really into this stuff, and she was rather unassuming. It was not confrontational in any way, did not jump on these things. He was not allowed to talk. So she says, they see 2,200 checks every week. They can't be expected, to look at everyone. I don't know, something like that. End of the trial. So the judge is clearly like at one point, and we have this on video. The whole thing's on video. I got the screenshot of their attorney saying something. The judge has his hand in his face like this, Oh, the other thing the attorney said was, he said, look, if they write in 2 times Medicare, we're forced to accept that consent. We're forced to accept their payment. And the judge said, so if they wrote in $1, you'd be forced to accept it. And the guy says, yes. And if I was there, I would say, no, you are forced to treat the patient. You are not forced to treat the patient on their own terms, or everybody would say they want it to be treated for $1, right? But I couldn't say it. So then after the trial, I have if you don't mind my saying so, brilliant idea of probably for the first time in the history of small claims court, writing an amicus curiae brief, okay? That's a Supreme Court thing, right? I'm going to do it for small claims court. So the plaintiff's husband, who's really into this stuff, looks around at the Ohio law and says, there's no governing statute. Nobody ever thought anybody would do that. And so we don't know if it's going to be accepted. So I had my other brilliant idea, which makes up for, by the way, my unbrilliant idea of being the plaintiff instead of the defendant. The other brilliant idea was, instead of just sending it in and hoping that it will be accepted, to send it in and write at the top of the motion, we realize that there is no precedent for this. There's no law governing this one way or the other. So what we're going to say is that we will proactively waive any objection to them submitting an amicus curiae brief, of course, which is like Ukraine saying, okay, well, we won't bomb hospitals and kindergartens in Russia if they don't bomb our kindergartens, right? So they have no intention of submitting this brief, So I was able to get in all those points on the amicus curiae brief, which was accepted specifically because the judge said, if you want to send another one in, fine. And the judge has finally had it up to here with, frankly, both of us, much more them than us, but both of us. So he says, February 10th, last brief, you both have one more chance, no new facts, no new evidence, no new witnesses, just the law. So we write this great brief. And once again, I don't want to take, more than half the credit. I mean, the plaintiff's husband was as good a non-attorney attorney as I have ever seen. So we wrote this brief. They didn't actually submit a brief. And that was February 10th. And we still don't have a decision. Almost 2 months later, we think what's happened is that whereas a typical small claims court decision is 2 sentences, 1 paragraph, whatever, that the judge is afraid that Ohio Health, having already, gone into this for about $50,000 as near as we can tell, is going to appeal. So he's writing sort of a big court decision on this, handling all the points, because no judge, especially in small claims court, wants to be appealed and certainly not overturned on appeal. So he's taking his time about it. But I mean, there's no way we lose. And I frankly don't think we lose an appeal. And if they do appeal, I'm going to bring my son in, who best of Boston litigator, according to Boston Magazine, who's going to just slam this 160, we call him Mr. 161, this 161 ranked law school guy to smithereens. But, the decision hasn't happened yet. So I would love to be able to say, yeah, we won and they lost the appeal or didn't appeal. Can't say that yet. So another Guinness Book of World Records thing, there's probably not been a small claims case in history where it's taken this long.
There's a first for everything, but we'll be following along. We will certainly keep our listeners posted. Don't you worry.
Oh, yes. You'll be among the very first. I've told a lot of people they'll be the first to know. And so I'm telling people now they'll be among the very first to know.
Among the first. That's that. I appreciate that. Well, more coming on that. But as we round out the show, you mentioned a little bit earlier the Validation Institute. And of course, you wear many hats in the...
I have a bald spot back here, so I have...
you wear so many. That's right. In addition to Quizify, you are the founder and validator-in-chief of Validation Institute. Can we end by just giving a quick plug for the work that the Validation Institute does?
Yes. So 80% of vendors are honest, but those 80% only have, by the way, largely the ones on the Granite List, those 80% only have about 20% of all the business. The 20% who are the cartel or dishonest, who are, getting money per script and doing all sorts of stuff, they get the 80%. And what we try to do at the Validation Institute is raise the visibility of the 80% of vendors who should be getting 80% of the business, raise it both by the validation and also by the street cred, where we can say, we're in Marty McCary's best-selling book. We get a shout out. We've written a couple of books on this, Why Nobody Believes in Numbers being the number one. And we're in a Harvard Business School case study even about valid measurement. And so then I take the Marty McCary book and the Harvard Business School case study. I say, this makes us the only healthcare organization and possibly the only thing of any kind that Harvard and the Trump administration agree on. So we've got this great street cred, but then we also put up a $100,000 ERISA immunity guarantee. So if we say so-and-so, Green Imaging, Hibiscus, whoever saves money, they save money. And if they don't, you will not be sued by your employees who will say you're mismanaging your plan. In fact, somebody actually asked us the other day, for large organizations, can we go to $1 million? And under the right circumstances, we would go to $1 million. Because if we say something is valid, it's valid.
Enough said, as the kids say these days. We at the Granite List are very proud to partner with both Quizify and the Validation Institute. We love the work that is being done on both of those fronts. And we certainly encourage our listeners to learn more. Obviously, you can learn more at thegranitelist.com or Quizify.com or validationinstitute.com. Al, thank you for your leadership in this industry. Keep fighting the good fight. I know it isn't easy. And on that note, thank you. And thank you to our listeners for tuning into another episode of the Granite List.Live.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Granite List.Live. Access our entire library by visiting your favorite podcast venue or subscribe on our site, thegranitelist.live.